Welcome, everyone. My name is Julien. I'm a junior studying economics.
And my name is Abhay, and I'm a junior studying applied math and econ.
And together we are the directors of the Charles River Economics Labs, which is a student-run nonprofit that conducts pro bono economics research for government agencies, intergovernmental organizations, and think tanks. So each semester we run research projects, but in addition to our research projects, we also conduct a speaker series in which we invite prominent members of the economics community to speak about their research, the current macro climate, current events, their career trajectories, what have you. And so today I'm pleased to welcome Professor Jason Furman, the Aetna Professor of the Practice of Economic Policy, jointly at HKS and the Economics Department. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute and was chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. Many of you likely know him from Ec 10, which is Harvard's introductory econ course. And so there's sort of no one more knowledgeable or better informed than Professor Furman about what we're here to talk about today, which is President Trump's economic agenda during his second term and the sort of macroeconomic impacts that it will have both in America and abroad. So please give a warm welcome to Jason Furman. So for the first half of the conversation, Abhay and I will conduct a sort of guided Q&A, and then we'll open the floor to questions from you all. Let's turn it over to Abhay.
Yeah, so we're here to talk about the economic agenda of the incoming administration. So let's start by addressing the elephant in the room, tariffs. Trump recently announced on Truth Social that there's going to be a 25% tariff on all goods imported from Canada and Mexico. And during the campaign, he also proposed raising tariffs on China to somewhere around the 60% level. And he's even considered imposing a universal 10% tariff on all imported goods, even those from European allies and free trade agreement partners. So, Jason, we'd love if you could walk us through these different tariff scenarios. One, who pays for these tariffs? Two, how could they affect prices, the labor market, and top-line GDP growth? And then also, if you have any idea, which scenario do you think Trump is most likely to implement?
Great. Well, it's great to be with all of you, and I'm super sorry to anyone that's already listened to me for an hour and 15 minutes today, but I guess it's your fault. But for some of the others, it's like a homecoming or an introduction. So let me give you my meta theory about Trump in order to answer your question. I think of three buckets of issues that are affected in different ways. And what's very hard with him is he said a lot of things in the campaign. It is very common for presidents to get elected and not do a bunch of things they said in their campaign, either because they realized it was a bad idea, because they were lying to begin with, or because Congress wouldn't pass it. And I would say it is fair to say the gap between the things President Trump says and does might be larger than average for all of the above reasons. And so it's hard to figure out which of the things he says he'll do and which of them he won't do. So first of all, a little bit of an algorithm for it. There's a bucket of things that the stock market cares about and provide very quick feedback on. Tariffs would be in that bucket. Probably most of what we're going to talk about would be in that bucket. There, my base case is that he will not do things that dramatically upset the stock market. And so for something like tariffs, he'll pull back quite a lot on it. But I'll give you a little bit more nuance on tariffs in a moment. Second, there's a bucket of things that the stock market doesn't care much about or might even like, and I would call typical Republican. Deregulation, less emphasis on regulations for climate change, a smaller budget for what's called non-defense discretionary spending, just mainstream Republican positions. I would expect all of that to happen, and we can discuss some of that in more detail. Then there's a third set of things, which is things that the stock market doesn't care about and are not mainstream Republican. And I would include, for example, nominating Matt Gaetz, who has since dropped out, for the Justice Department, or Kash Patel to direct the FBI. And there's just no constraint, really, on what the president does. And he's trying to do things, president-elect, that are somewhat different from what I think most Republicans would have historically done. You see this in his economic appointments. He's made 2 economic appointments so far, and they're both very mainstream. Scott Bessent as Treasury Secretary as recently as January was talking about how tariffs would destroy the U.S. economy. Kevin Hassett as Director of the National Economic Council is a very good economist. He was chair of the CEA before, very much believes in free trade and the like. And some people that are not free traders haven't been in this administration. By the way, future questions I'm going to be shorter, but this one I think helps set the scene for some of the other ones. So he's had pretty mainstream appointments on the economic side. Now, when it comes to tariffs, there's 2 different models. One is he's just a negotiating position, and you can act like a crazy person and win in negotiations. And you've already seen Justin Trudeau fly from Canada to meet him at Mar-a-Lago, and he's a brilliant negotiator, and we're not going to actually have all of this, and the world will be fine. A second possibility, though, is that he does truly believe in tariffs. And this is what gives me pause and why I'm not certain on the stock market restraining him and the brilliant negotiator model. When he says that other countries pay for the tariffs and Americans don't, I think he believes that. When he thinks the world is zero-sum, I think he believes that. And so on tariffs, you have this conflict between a deep-seated belief and a pragmatism stock market negotiation. I think the pragmatism stock market negotiation, for the most part, wins out. But 20-25% chance I'm wrong. And even in that scenario, I think we end up with tariffs above what I personally would have done, including pretty substantial tariffs on China. And the last thing I'd say is I mostly don't like any tariffs, but if you put me in charge of industrial policy, I'd try to be smart about the tariffs. And there's a big issue, which is, for example, half of our imports are intermediate goods for manufacturers. So you want to make a car in this country, you need batteries from abroad. You need steel from abroad. You have tariffs on batteries and steel, it actually hurts your ability to make cars and to export cars. And so a bunch of these tariffs, I think, will even be counterproductive, even if your goal is the manufacturing sector. So the bottom line, the answer to every question is I don't know. I think Donald Trump doesn't know. I don't think anyone knows. But where the stock market is in play, I think there'll be restraint.
Yeah, so thank you. I guess a follow-up to that is sort of, could you walk us through precisely how some of these different tariff scenarios will sort of materially affect how consumers, will pay for their everyday items? So, you can imagine how it affects different industries differently, and the analysis is probably different for different types of goods. So if you're importing things like industrial components, it's probably very difficult for an American factory to just switch who their supplier is immediately. But for things like clothing or, other products that come from China, like smartphones and whatnot, that maybe are more easily substitutable, I'm just sort of wondering if the analysis is different at all and sort of where you think the most pain will come.
Yeah. So, and by the way, I should have said one more thing on tariffs, almost in response to the previous, but it'll segue into this one as well, which is the other thing to decide whether things will happen or not is, do they require Congress? And the law gives the president a lot of discretion to set tariffs. That is especially true on China, where there's literally special laws about China. It's true anywhere where you can assert national security, and largely courts defer. So if you say Canada is a national security threat to the United States, it's never been tested in a court, but courts would probably say we don't have the expertise to decide, whether that's total nonsense or not. So if the president says Canada is a national security threat, we're going to defer to that. So I think there's probably a wide degree of latitude, but there's definitely more on China, for example, than there is on Canada. So what would the tariffs do? Well, the first thing to understand about tariffs is the main consequence of tariffs is two main consequences of tariffs are, number one, you get less imports. That's obvious. The price of things goes up, so you buy less of them. The second is you get less exports. There's two ways to think about that. One is the tariffs decrease the demand for foreign currency. That lowers the price of foreign currency. That raises the price of your currency. That's an appreciation of the dollar. And when the dollar appreciates, it's harder to do exports. The second is you can think of it through something called the Lerner symmetry theorem, which we don't cover in Ec 10. I don't know if you do in 1010, 1011, other classes here. But basically, you can just think of it as all the people that were working to, you stop importing stuff, whatever manufactured good, clothing. All of a sudden, a bunch of Americans start making clothing. What were those Americans doing before? They were making some other thing to export. And they're pulled out of the export industry to make things for Americans. And so the main impact of tariffs is to shrink the volume of trade, less imports, which is a goal that Trump has, but also less exports. And the trade balance staying roughly the same as determined by saving and investment. Then I think your question was about the sectoral impacts. It just depends a lot on what tariffs you did. And are you taxing final goods? Or the things that consumers buy, or are you taxing intermediate inputs like steel and batteries and the like? It can affect the composition of industry. So the EV tariffs that Biden put on, 100% tariffs, do mean we will have, I think, a larger auto industry for the next few years than we would have otherwise. I don't think it changes the total trade balance or manufacturing. So we'll have a larger auto industry, but a smaller, some other manufacturing industry. But the sectoral stuff is, it's just so much in the details. But whatever it is, lower living standards for consumers, less comparative advantage, roughly the same trade deficit, changing the pattern of manufacturing, but not the total amount of manufacturing.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. I'd love to kind of follow up on that. I think you touched on some interesting points about sort of how tariffs have these balancing effects and kind of don't necessarily have very significant benefits to the communities that maybe they're targeted towards. This kind of reminds me of a paper, I think it was David Autor and Gordon Hanson. They had a working paper about a year ago, and they kind of showed that the 2018 tariffs and their specific focus on certain industries did not necessarily lead to huge job growth in the counties that they were kind of aimed towards. But what they did show is that it actually did lead to significant rightward political shifts in these counties. So there was sort of this political effect that kind of came from this idea of, hey, we're going to implement tariffs, we're going to help, the heartland of American manufacturing, we're going to have these kind of changes. And so the question I kind of have for you here then is, obviously these voters are going to continue to be important to winning elections in the future, and they want to have their voices heard. They're kind of interested in figuring out how their manufacturing jobs or their specific livelihoods are going to continue. Are there other ways that you can kind of think of that address these problems? Is it found in the Kamala America Forward tax credits or incentives? Is it found in other creative policies? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah. So first of all, we should understand manufacturing workers are about 8% of total employment. Moreover, most of what's called a manufacturing worker might actually be like an accountant or a salesperson for a manufacturing company. If you look at the number of people that are actually like making stuff and what most of our image of manufacturing is, it's really, really quite low. One area where it's still high in the United States is actually in the meatpacking business, which is basically manufacturing. Lots of people work in meatpacking plants, and that's why when COVID spread, you saw that was one of the big areas of spread was in meatpacking plants. You didn't hear about COVID spreading in microchip plants because there's like 2 people in each microchip plant. By the way, they're like wearing the big hood and all that too. I've been confused and don't have a good answer. Politicians love to talk about manufacturing and to talk about all the good they're doing for manufacturing. One model for that is politicians lately have been like mostly over the age of 75, and they just like nostalgically remember a world 40 years ago and want to have that world, but they're actually not maximizing votes because 90% of voters are not in manufacturing. And by the way, the 10% that are, a majority of them don't want their children in manufacturing and want their children to do something different. So one possibility is the political system romanticizes this in a way that's sort of error-prone. Another is an efficient markets hypothesis, which is the political system is very good at figuring out how to maximize votes. The people that aren't good at it get eliminated. And manufacturing is more than 10% in certain key states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, for example, in the recent election. And so its power gets magnified in the presidential process. So first, I'm not even sure whether it's a rational political goal, but it certainly is a goal that President Biden had. It was a goal that Harris had, I think to a bit of a lesser extent, but to a decent extent, and a goal that Trump had. I think the problem is, first of all, from an economic perspective, you want people to have sort of good, high-paid jobs. And manufacturing used to have a very large premium relative to other jobs. If you were like a man without a high school degree, without a college degree, I mean, you could get paid quite a lot in manufacturing. That's actually changed a lot. You know, if you want to work in one of the microchip plants, you need a master's degree or more. And meatpacking plants don't pay very much, and then auto plants are somewhere in between those two extremes. There's a lot of service jobs that do actually pay and pay better. So I don't, so first of all, I don't think it should be a goal. Second of all, you look at manufacturing jobs as a share, and it's just gone straight down. And like every event, whether it's an election, a trade agreement, a global event, you don't see it because it's a straight line down. So I am skeptical that it should be a goal, skeptical we can do anything about it, but I agree that there is some chance, but I'm not sure that saying you're going to do something about it helps you win an election ex ante, even if delivering doesn't matter ex post.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess, the consensus on these tariffs are that they will pretty much assuredly increase prices for consumers. I guess I just wanted to ask whether this complicates the picture on inflation. Over the past year, there's been sort of this trend that as we've progressed, there have been several rate cuts, and there's this sense that maybe inflation is done. It's sort of coming back down below 3%. There's a sense that we've managed to successfully have a soft landing because the economy has been doing very well, both in terms of investment, top line GDP, unemployment is pretty low. And, obviously, maybe the new FOMC projections came in a little bit high recently. But in general, there's been this sense that inflation has been, solved. And I guess I wanted to ask whether the tariffs sort of challenge that to some extent and whether you sense some unease at the Fed, maybe to think more about, okay, maybe we'll delay future rate cuts. Sort of how do you think the tariffs play into the Fed's calculus?
Right. So on the unease at the Fed, they've been very good and very disciplined at not looking like they're commenting on this topic at all. So it would be very hard to sense what's going on in their heads, although one could obviously guess. I think the issue is right now, inflation looks like it's right around 2.5%. I mean, there's different ways of measuring it. Core PCE inflation, which is de facto the Fed's target, is actually 2.8% over the last year, but I think there's some things that have temporarily pushing that up. So I think it's around 2.5%. I think if it falls to 2.3, let's say, we're fine. The Fed's done, mission accomplished. That rounds to 2%, which is their goal. If it goes to 2.7, I think that's it for rate. If it stays at 2.7, that's it for rate cuts. They're not going to keep cutting rates. And in fact, if it's still 2.7 2 years from now, they're going to be raising rates to try to get rid of it. And so we're in a world where a couple tenths matter. I said I was skeptical of tariffs. I should have been clearer. I'm skeptical of like the big sort of full Monty tariffs. I think there'll be some, as I said, more than I'd like, and probably enough to raise inflation by a few tenths. And so that could put pressure on the Fed. Now, there's a few complications here. First of all, it's a one-time increase in the price level. That will be measured as inflation over a given year. Does that build itself into permanently higher inflation? Well, that would depend on things like expectations and how prices affect wages and wages affect prices. So it will be unclear as to whether it's a one-time thing, which the Fed should look through, or permanent, which it shouldn't. Second is it might come accompanied by a reduction in economic activity, which would say the Fed wants to cut rates rather than raise rates. The third is the Fed de facto targets financial conditions, not just the Fed funds rate. And the tariffs, if they were done, especially in a big way, would mean like the stock market would go down. Maybe long-term interest rates would go up. And so the economy would tighten all on its own without the Fed doing anything. So it's not totally obvious what the Fed does if you do the tariffs, but my guess is they put us, at least temporarily, on the wrong side of 2.5, which means take the rate cuts off the table, maybe put rate increases back on the table, and make the president-elect unhappy. Yeah,
so taking a more global perspective, right? So if you I mean, you said that this was sort of a one-time price increase is one way you can kind of look at the tariffs, right? But if you sort of see maybe a tit for tat kind of war, trade war, where you kind of have continually retaliatory tariffs, do you think that the picture kind of changes on a global scale?
Yeah, and by the way, I should have talked about that retaliation part before. So, for example, one thing that will be hurt by tariffs is farmers. Why? Because other countries will put tariffs on our farm exports, and that's a big part of American exports. And last time around, they got bailed out with farm assistance, but otherwise they would have been hurt quite a lot. So the retaliation part is a big part of this. And yes, that affects the inflation part of it. In part, the stronger dollar that you might get from tariffs, you don't get if there's retaliation for the tariffs. And the stronger dollar is deflationary. So one of the things that would have helped offset some of the price increases from the tariffs would have been movement in the exchange rate, which would get neutralized with retaliation.
Got it. Well, thank you so much for talking about tariffs. I guess I'd like to shift gears a little bit and ask about immigration. So Trump, this is obviously, the second portion of Trump's policy agenda as far as he's articulated it. He proposed several extreme immigration restrictions. He's claimed he wants to carry out the largest domestic deportation operation in American history, including by instructing immigration and customs enforcement to raid workplaces and by deploying both the military and the National Guard to round up and deport unauthorized immigrants. Most estimates suggest that there are approximately 8 million undocumented immigrants in the workforce. So I guess, could you just provide some intuition on how these immigration policies would affect the labor supply in various sectors and what the implications are for the economy? I think many are skeptical that Trump will actually be able to carry out a bunch of what he said. But even in sort of a more limited scheme, will we see impacts in, the housing market and things like that?
So one big thing I think is very likely is that the inflow of immigrants to the country, certainly undocumented, possibly documented, will fall quite a lot. And that matters because that's been a big part of economic growth in the last couple of years. In fact, it looks like ex post over the last 2 years, the U.S. potential growth rate might have been something like 3.5%. Actual growth was 3%, so we're growing below potential. That's consistent with an unemployment rate rising and inflation falling. Without that inflow of immigrants, our potential growth rate would have been something more like 2%. And so the first thing I do is sort of cancel much of the inflow in terms of your mental projections, lower potential growth. Now, 2% potential growth, perfectly fine, and we could adjust to it, and life would be perfectly fine and better than a lot of other, or really any other, advanced economy. But is a minus, for sure. Then there's all the people who are here, which is what your question was about. I think removing 8 million people would, separate from my moral views on it, which are very, very strong, would trigger the stock market issue we said. The estimates I've seen are that it would take a decade and cost hundreds of billions of dollars and be a massive, massive effort. Moreover, I think the politics of this issue, which right now are very much on Donald Trump's side and very much against where the Democrats have been or perceived to have been, would flip if you got to anything resembling that. So I don't think that would happen. And you look at the immigration coordinators appointed in the White House, he's quite hard line, but he talks about people with a criminal conviction, for example. So now let's talk about a smaller scenario. What's a criminal conviction? You could be somebody, you're working in your local church, you're helping out, everyone in the community loves you, and 20 years ago you had like a very minor thing. Is ICE going to round you up and deport you? I think that would get very ugly very quickly, but maybe not ugly to the point that it triggers the stock market because it's not at the scale of the stock market. And so I could see things like that happening. But again, the caveat to all of this, a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, and do you have maybe an understanding of what specific industries might be most affected?
Yeah. Oh, by the way, you asked about housing. So it's that. I mean, a lot of these things are tricky because immigrants are supply and immigrants are demand. So immigrants build houses, but immigrants also need houses. And so both the supply and demand falls. The research has been actually a bit ambiguous as to the impact that immigration has on house prices, with and it depends a lot on the circumstances and which houses. But certainly in things like the farm industry matters quite a lot. In the construction industry, immigrants, the type of immigrants he's targeting. In leisure and hospitality, like restaurants and retail. I mean, it's all of these industries that would be most disrupted by it. But then there's high tech, there's, which is something where, he said different things. At one point, he said anyone with a STEM degree could get a green card. And then he sort of took it back the next day. And, what the future of AI in the United States versus China is depends a lot on which direction he chooses to go with something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess shifting gears a little bit. So one thing that was very interesting to me about this election is that despite top-line numbers about the state of the American economy, at least from my understanding, 2024 has been sort of one of the best years in recent memory. GDP growth, consumer spending, investment, all relatively high. Despite that, many people felt as if the economy was not doing very well. And perhaps this was because, although inflation had been coming down, price levels, at the level were still much higher than they were 4 years ago. But whatever may be the case, I think many election forecasters and political scientists found that these poor economic perceptions about the economy had a big impact on the election outcome and sort of disfavored the incumbent. And so I guess I just wanted to get your sense of sort of what explains this divergence between the top line numbers and popular attitudes. So I guess.
Yep. So first of all, let me just quickly explain my approach to thinking and talking about this, and then I'll get to the specifics. There's certain people who just are relentlessly, isn't it awesome? Biden is the best. Every economic data point is fantastic. That has not been my approach in the last 4 years. I try to call balls and strikes. How many of you are on Twitter, by the way? How many of you are on Blue Sky? I'm now posting to both, if you want to follow it, where I try to call balls and strikes. And I think some data has been really good. U.S. growth has been much faster than other advanced economies. Inflation has come down quite a lot. Some of the claims about it all being catastrophic are obviously totally wrong and misleading and false, and it's worth pointing that out. But I also have consistently pointed out the challenges people face. Right now, for example, median incomes are lower than they were prior to COVID. The poverty rate's higher than it was prior to COVID. And real wages are at the very least below the path or the trend they were on prior to COVID, even if they've increased, even if nominal wages have increased more than prices. And so I think there is an actual nuanced reality there. And first of all, I don't view my job as doing propaganda for a political party. But second of all, I'm not even sure if you like that political party, if you're doing them a favor, if you just talk about how great things are. And there were people when inflation was 7, 8, 9% talking about how great everything was, as long as you just didn't buy a car or food or use electricity because it didn't matter, because the one thing, eventually even that one thing that you could buy at a low price went up in price, and you stop being able to say that. So I don't think you're even doing your friends a favor if you create a false impression. And I do think that a certain amount of the Democratic echo chamber created a false impression about all of this. Now, I don't think if the communication would have been very different other than that. I don't think that's why the Democrats lost the election, but I think it didn't help. Now, in terms of pessimism, so I think part of it is a rational, you don't eat GDP, you eat real wages. And real wages are off trend. So I think part of it's rational. I think people were more negative than made sense, even conditional on a correct reading of the data. And that is, partisanship or the hangover from COVID or money illusion, where you think that you deserved your wage increase and that the price increase was this horrible thing that Biden did to you, when in reality your wage increase and the price increase are actually closely related, and the same thing helped cause both of them. So I think there was a combination of sort of rational and irrational, and it's foolish to say it was all irrational and dismiss what people feel, but I don't think, when 50% of the country says we're currently in recession, or at least did say that 2 months ago, I think some of them changed their minds. I think they're saying that there's something above and beyond just the data going on too.
Yeah, I think you bring up.
We weren't in a recession 2 months ago. What's going on now? Who knows? We don't have the data yet.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, sort of this idea of there both being a rational portion and an irrational, potentially irrational portion to how people kind of saw the economy. But, thinking more on the political side, how do you think the Democrats should recalibrate in order to win back voters who may have been unimpressed with the party's economic agenda? Do they primarily need to think about rethinking their policies or their messaging, as you sort of mentioned? Or do you think part of it was that just the electorate unfairly blamed Democrats for macroeconomic phenomena outside of their party's control, mainly supply shocks, the shift in aggregate demand and consumer spending? How would you kind of think through that question?
Yeah, so first of all, that has a large non-economic dimension too, which I won't be addressing here. And it has a large economic dimension, which I also won't be addressing here, because I don't know the answer to your question, and it's not the main thing I wake up every day trying to figure out. Anyone who the day after the election thought the more that their own policy ideas were followed, the better the Democrats would have done is not an empiricist. If you want the Democratic Party to win the next election and you're focused on the politics of it, you want to really be open-minded and empirical about it. So I hated the price gouging proposal. I said publicly very negative things about the price gouging proposal. There were people that were upset that I said those negative things. I'm not going to go say like, oh, if she hadn't done that, she would have won. I mean, for all I know, if she had like doubled down on it and made it like, we're going to shoot price gougers on the spot and make all your groceries free, then she would have won. And like, she was afraid that I would have criticized that even more strongly. And as a result of listening to me, she lost the election. So I just am not going to sit here and tell you like the things I think are good policies or what would have like won the election. What I will tell you though, and this does get to part of your question, is if somebody does win an election, so I'll give this as free advice to Donald Trump, then economists actually do know something about the consequences of your policies. And the consequences of your policies matter for your re-election. So yes, it might be a way to get elected to promise to like shoot people on the spot and make grocery prices free. As an economist, I could tell you, if you do that, there will be shortages and like people will starve to death and dead people won't vote for you. And so, if you're promising it, in some sense, my economic analysis doesn't matter. If you're actually lucky enough to be the dog that catches the bus and do it, then my economic analysis matters quite a lot. So a few years ago, for example, they were talking about a gas tax holiday, 18.4-cent tax. We're going to get rid of that tax. And my thing was the tax incidence analysis will say that will lower the price by about 2 cents. And by the way, they were going to propose it just as prices were going up for seasonal reasons. They always go up through May or June. And so probably the seasonal increase was going to outweigh that. And so people would observe it happening, observe oil company profits go up and observe prices go up. And my point was, it is possible this does well in a poll, but if you actually did this, and there's a 75% chance gas prices go up after you do it, and a 95% chance oil company profits go up after you do it, it's not going to look that great ex post. And it's that second type of analysis that I view myself as having some expertise in.
Yeah, so one ex post analysis that you did back, in Trump's first term is on the 2017 tax cuts. I remember you wrote a paper that was sort of estimating the impact that they had on GDP, over a fairly long time horizon. And I guess I just wanted to ask a little bit about how you anticipate Trump will revisit the tax question. So naturally, some of the proposals that he implemented in 2017 are timing out, and so he may want to renew those. But he's also suggested that he may want to also remove taxes on tips and slash corporate taxes even more than they were back in 2017. And so I guess, just the way you did that sort of causal economic analysis then, do you have a sense of how that'll affect growth, how it'll affect the deficit, how it'll affect inequality this time around?
Yeah, so you're referring to a paper I did with Robert Barrows, one of the most conservative people in the economics department. We had a big disagreement about the effects of the tax cuts, so we got together and wrote a paper together, fought it out, and actually came to the same answer. So we were originally going to publish 2 different answers and do a crosswalk to explain why our views were different so people could understand why we had a different view, but we ended up not having a different view. And we found the tax cuts would, from 2017, would add about 0.4 to the level of GDP, spread over a decade, would be half of a tenth of a percentage point on the annual growth rate, and there's some variance in there that might make it lower with deficits and the like. The important thing is all the tax cuts that was about were basically the corporate tax changes, and they were made permanent. At the same time, there were a set of individual tax cuts that expire in 2025, and that's what the debate will be about next year. Those individual tax cuts have very little to do with growth. They have something to do with simplicity. For example, larger standard deduction, fewer people need to itemize their taxes, and it'll make it easier for them to do their taxes. But if you talk to the architects of the tax cut, like Paul Ryan, who was the Speaker of the House at the time, they did it on purpose. The things that mattered for growth were permanent. The things that didn't matter and weren't quite as high a priority, they made temporary. And they thought if they went away, that's not terrible. And by the way, there'll be more political pressure to extend them because they're for individuals. So I don't think there's a lot of growth from the expiring tax cuts. And in fact, there's a minus to growth because you get larger deficits. And the deficit is getting to be a bigger problem now than it was 7 years ago. 7 or 8 years ago. The second thing is all the new campaign proposals. I don't know a tax expert anywhere on the political spectrum that thinks any of them make any sense. Tax-free tips, you will get a lot of growth in that, growth in tips, as opposed to salary, wage income. Tax-free overtime, same thing. You'll just get more overtime work, but less regular work, and it won't change just change the labels on it. Tax-free Social Security, I don't think you get any extra anything from that. So you read like the Wall Street Journal editorial page, they tend to be more enthusiastic about tax cuts than me. They were like pulling their hair out every time he had one of these proposals. So I think most of his tax things this time are a minus for growth, either because they're distorting things or because they're raising the deficit, or in many cases a combination of both, as opposed to last time where I did think there was an argument for a positive effect on growth, although I thought it was pretty small.
Yeah, I'd love to take a bit more of a look at some of the permanent parts of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. We kind of saw with corporate taxes, there's a pretty big slash, and you reviewed Gabriel Chowdhury-Reich paper about a year ago that showed a very, very clear relationship between firm investment and exogenous tax changes and tax cuts, even though there's some higher depreciation that offset labor and corporate tax revenue from the proposal. But my point is that there might be an argument that this greater capital accumulation, which is pretty non-trivial in the long run, is beneficial for long-term economic growth, productivity, innovation, all of that whole shebang. So how do you sort of think about balancing these costs, higher deficit, the cost to the government and the people, and taking a stand on, these sorts of corporate tax proposals?
Yeah, so that paper is Gabriel Chowdhury-Reich. She's a professor here in the economics department. He found a pretty similar number to the one Robert Barrow and I did, using a very different method in terms of growth from the tax cuts. Broadly, I think the growth effects are small enough that they're dominated for me by the distributional effects. And given my social welfare function, if you're raising after-tax incomes more for high-income households than low-income households, you're giving money to people who need it least. And yes, there is the everyone goes up from the growth, but you sort of get everyone grows up a little bit, and then like different people go different ways because of the distribution. So for me, I judge it primarily through a distributional lens. That wouldn't be true of every tax change, but that would be true of these tax changes.
So earlier you mentioned that one of the biggest effects will be on the deficit. I guess I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on how concerned we should be about budget deficits and the debt in general. In Act 10, you sort of explain debt sustainability as a tug of war between the interest rate and the growth rate, and how if the interest rate is less than the growth rate, the debt will always stabilize. Currently, the 10-year Treasury is, I think, 4.2%. Do you see that as concerning? Do you see an extension of the individual side of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act as significantly contributing to the deficit? And if so, whether that's a significant problem?
Yeah. So first of all, I should say, if you're interested in this, I will have a paper that is released in the next week that covers in gory detail, but very readable, enjoyable, pleasant, gory detail, the answer to your question. The second thing I should say is I constantly change my mind on this, and that's partly because the data changes. And so I rationally update, and it's partly based on the mood I'm in and whether I got a good night's sleep. and the like. The third reason that one should change one's mind is Argentina had a huge fiscal crisis with debt at 45% of GDP, and the UK did just fine with debt at 250% of GDP. And so it's very hard to figure out what a threshold is. It depends on expectations and institutions and sunspots and all sorts of other things. I think my very short answer is we are on an unsustainable fiscal course. If you take the Trump campaign plans and discount raising $2 trillion a year through Doge, and I would discount it quite heavily, we are on an even more unsustainable course. I don't think anything in that is anything resembling a crisis, even a crisis of the magnitude that the UK had 2 years ago when Prime Minister Liz Truss proposed her tax cuts. But I think the more you go on with it, it's sort of termites in the woodwork, chipping away at living standards, making the eventual cost of dealing with it higher, and increasing the risk that you would have to do if you deal with it. So my own thing would be do no harm, do bite-sized improvements every time you can, address Social Security and Medicare within the next decade, because that's when they become insolvent. But I will have an op-ed that makes a number of those points in the Wall Street Journal later that week, but I don't expect it to be fully persuasive to really anyone.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about those bite-sized proposals? What are sort of the realistic pathways to deal with the problem?
Yeah. So look, what I'd love to see is every time you pass a new law, it's not just paid for, but paid for and reduces the deficit a little bit. So you have like $500 billion of tax cuts you want to give. Great. You have to cut spending by $600 billion. So you're cutting the deficit by $100 billion. Or you're a Democrat, you have this like cool new spending program, $500 billion, you need to raise taxes by $600. So it's not just that you're paying for things, but you're sort of overpaying for them. And you do a sequence of that and you're in better shape. I should say I was sort of derisive about my persuasive abilities, and mostly I'm in a university because I've given up on people that are older than all of you who are making decisions, and hoping you'll listen to me, remember all of this, and make better decisions when you're in charge 20 years from now. Or less, J.D. Vance, 15 years out of college. That was sort of serious, but also in seriousness, I do think who knows where we are 2 years from now. If interest rates go up a lot, and they could, you said the 10 years at 4.2, it could be above 5, it could be above 6. I think people will care a lot about deficit reduction. Moreover, I would bet a decent amount of money that the Democrats will win the House 2 years from now, because that's how it always happens, and there's even more reasons to think so now than usual. So we'll have divided government and possibly more concerns about the deficit, and so these types of let's do a series of bite-sized things could be back on the table.
Well, thank you. I guess I just wanted to close this portion of the discussion with a final question about sort of a lecture that you gave at the Peterson Institute, I think in September, about, sort of in defense of the dismal science, which in this case is economics. You describe some of the common pitfalls in economic analysis, which you call vices. Liberals, you argued, sort of tend to deny trade-offs and assume all good things come together, having their cake and eating it too. And conservatives tend to either overinflate or overfixate on the costs of any given policy. And I found that very resonant. And I was just wondering if you could provide examples of those vices in the context of the recent campaign, maybe in the context of Trump's new, proposals, the challenges to orthodox economics that we've seen crop up with modern monetary theory and this sort of neo-Brandesian approach to antitrust. So if you could just give some more clarity on what those actually look like, that would be great.
Sure. I'll give you 2 examples. Climate change is one. There's a democratic view that the best thing we can do for our economy, to make middle-class jobs, to help economic growth, is to tackle climate change. That's nonsense. We would not invent a problem with carbon dioxide in order to create jobs if it weren't actually a problem. It's not like the idea that you're going to take a bunch of carbon dioxide and put it in a truck and then put it in a pipe and send it to the bottom of a cavern to sequester it. That's like a really, really idiotic thing to do to create jobs. But it has a benefit of it reduces climate change, and each ton of carbon does damage. By the way, most of the damage it does is to lives. Most of those lives are in the future. Most of those lives are in other countries. I think all of that is incredibly morally worthwhile to deal with, but it's not the same as growth over the next year in the United States or even over the next 50 years in the United States. And so democratic climate ideas largely involve doing things that have a cost, that divert resources and activity from something useful to doing something sort of useless and pointless, but also have a benefit because you're getting rid of the carbon. And then you want to balance the costs and the benefits. And some things like more solar and wind make sense. Some things like subsidies for EVs, I don't think actually do make sense. I think they cost more than is justified. Then there's the Republican approach, which is you point out the costs that I just said. You then magnify the costs. If you do this on climate change, you're going to destroy economic growth. You're going to destroy the economy. We'll lose all our jobs because of it. You're going to kill the whole industry. And when you magnify the costs so much, you can either ignore the benefits, or you don't really even need to ignore the benefits anymore because the costs are infinity. It doesn't really matter a whole lot what the benefits are. So the Democratic approach, you get benefit-benefit analysis. Under benefit-benefit analysis, you want to do everything. And you don't really need to do economic studies except as propaganda to convince people of how awesome it is to do your thing. Under the Republic, by the way, these are incredibly stylized. Not all Democrats are like this. Not all Republicans are like this. Sometimes they cross roles. So this is just tendencies and fears. Under the Republican approach, you just need to do cost analysis. And again, the cost analysis isn't to help inform your decision. It's just to scare people and get to the result that you already knew the right answer. I think on climate change, like on almost everything, you need to analyze the benefits, analyze the costs, and put the two of them against each other. And that's, sort of a hard thing to do. It's a thing that many of you are learning to do or do through Charles River Labs and the like. Other one is antitrust, and I'll just be faster at this. I think big corporations are both good because they are big in part because they're good, and they do good things because of their scale. And they're also bad. They raise prices because of their bigness. And obviously, it's all more complicated than what I just said. And the right approach to mergers or monopolization cases and the like is balancing those costs and benefits. And if you think all good things go together and you can get rid of the big thing and everything's going to be better quality and you're going to have more innovation and more democracy or whatever, you're not doing the right analysis. And there would be a Republican version of that too, that any merger control is so costly, you should never do it.
So I guess one. There we go.
Mine still works.
Well, okay, mine works too. Sorry. So one last actual question before we turn it over. One thing that was interesting as you were talking about that is sort of this idea that maybe from the Republican side there is sort of any kind of cost analysis. It seems to me like many of these proposals that the Trump administration has put forward sort of eschews any analysis entirely and just, entirely seems to be propaganda. And I sort of question whether, the vice is maybe it's targeted towards the sort of never Trump conservatives, or maybe it's targeting all of them. I'm not sure, but I am sort of, I guess, a little bit skeptical as to whether there's even that initial level of, of analysis there.
Right. So I frame this a little bit as a plague on both your houses, that both sides are getting it wrong. I have been quite disappointed, frankly, with the Biden administration, which I think has not done and released good analysis on a number of things they've done, and I could do chapter and verse if you wanted. I think the first Trump administration and the Trump campaign were not very good either. I think the magnitudes, I think you're right, probably are different. And it's more like I'm disappointed in my friends and don't expect as much of the people that I'm less friendly with. And so end up being more critical one direction than the other, creating a false impression of an equivalence where there isn't one. I think that's very possible. But but it's not just the Trump administration. There's a set of conservative think tanks, and the conservative think tanks tend to put out cost analysis of regulations. And, then there's some liberal think tanks that do if you just tackle inequality and climate change and discrimination and everything else you hate about the world, you'll also get much more economic growth. So, I went back to my plague on both your houses. So yes, it is fair to say that like his policy shop on the campaign, if he had one in his campaign, I don't know if he did or didn't. They weren't releasing like white papers, a lot of numbers and things like that. But there were a set of allied outside things that do what I would call cost analysis.
All right, well, thank you so much. I guess we'll turn it over to questions from you all. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask? Rohan. Yeah, just talk. We don't need that.
So, completely different topic. People want to talk about Fed independence and how Trump might make Fed independence go away. How serious are we talking about independence and like what's the benefit of that?
Yeah, so the question is, and I'm going to repeat it in part also because of YouTube, in case people don't hear you. Fed independence, Trump's challenge to it, how serious is it? So the Fed is like, other than my children, sort of my favorite thing in the world. And so just any threat to it makes me just sad. And even if it's like a small remote risk, you tell me there's like a 1% chance you're going to murder my children, I wouldn't think like, 99% chance they're fine. That's okay. And that's sort of, I think the risk to the Fed is a little bit higher than that. Let's understand what he can and can't do. Assuming no legislation passes, and I don't think it could, it would require 60 votes in the Senate. Let's get rid of the filibuster. He only gets guaranteed 2 appointments on the Fed. Fed decisions are made by 12 people. I don't think he can do that much in 4 years. Moreover, he does get to appoint a chair in 2 years, and maybe he could try to fire Jay Powell. I think it's unlikely. I refer you back to my comments on the stock market before. But then there's a paradox, which is if he appoints like the craziest person in the world to the Fed, none of the other 11 FOMC voters are going to listen to them, and they won't be able to change monetary policy at all. If he appoints a totally mainstream person, yeah, they'll have a big influence, just like Jay Powell has had a big influence, but won't move it in Trump's direction with that influence. So the more he tries to do, in some sense, the more there's a counter reaction. But that's 4 years. Now let's do 8 years. 8 years, you get 4 appointments, and I'm not just talking about him. I don't think he's going to be president for 8 years. I'm talking about his successor. Now you get 4 appointments, at least. You probably get more than that because most people don't stay through their full term on the Fed. Then I think you could basically change it quite dramatically and shift the paradigm on the Fed. So I think the risk is that he gets started on a process, his successor continues. I think mean tweets about the Fed are very likely, especially because I don't think they're going to cut interest rates every meeting next year. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if they cut interest rates at no meetings next year. And I think he'll tweet his thoughts about that. And I think that'll increase volatility a little bit and be a small negative for the universe, but probably not as much of a negative as I'll make it out to be if I'm ever asked about it on CNBC. Or when I'm asked about it, I should say.
What disappointed you with the Biden administration?
So,
Repeat
yeah.
the question for the video. The question was about what disappointed Professor Furman about the Biden administration.
I think there was, first of all, not a lot of macroeconomic analysis around the $1.9 trillion American economic plan. And when I say not a lot, I didn't see any. And trying to understand what the data said about what the size should have been and what it was. And just about any way of reading the data gave you a much, much smaller size than that. I think there was no way ex ante to say. Then I think some of the macro commentary, at least in public, tended to be about what if everything goes right on inflation and nothing goes wrong on inflation. So there's the macro side of it. But then I think when it comes to things like industrial policy, student loan relief, and the like, I think it's all cost benefit. And that doesn't mean it's all a bad idea. I think the CHIPS Act, for example, was a good idea. But it's not a good idea because we're going to get better jobs out of it. I refer you back to the 2 people that work in each chip factory. There are more people that make the chip factories, but there's 2 people that work in each of them. Not being fact-checked here, am I? Here I am talking about like getting your analysis right, and I'm going on about 2 people per chip factory. But anyway, it's not a great way to create middle-class jobs. It's not a great way to get cheap microchips. The ones Taiwan makes are going to be much cheaper and better than anything we can make here in the United States. I'm pretty confident of that. It's about national security. And national security says you're willing to pay a higher cost and sacrifice in order for something, just like sanctions on Russia. No one would say we create middle-class jobs from that. We do that because it helps our national security. So I think the CHIPS program would pass a cost-benefit test, but you never really saw it. I think something like student loan relief, it gave money to a bunch of people that need it and are worthwhile and could benefit from it, but it also raised prices for everyone else. And it also resulted in higher interest rates and mortgage rates for everyone else. And it also, in the future, is going to result in more tax increases or more spending cuts. When I do the full analysis of all of that, it doesn't pass a test, a cost-benefit sort of / moral test for me. But I didn't see anything like that analysis done or at least talked about.
It seems like your view is that the Biden economic team behaved less responsibly overall than the Obama economic team that you were a part of. And I'm just curious, what do you think happened in the 4 years that Trump was president to sort of the Democratic economic establishment? What drove that change?
Yeah, so first of all, let me just say, our stimulus was too small in 2009. Theirs was too big in 2017. Now, I do think ours was too small because they didn't listen to us enough. Not because of our fault, but it might have been our fault too. So I think we got various things wrong. And by the way, I do say, I think they had a lot of excellent economic people in the administration. I was just talking about sort of the way in which that information was used, communicated, and integrated into the policymaking process. So this isn't like their economists were ignorant. It was more like, did they listen to their economists enough? That would be the first thing. What happened? I think President Biden is more of a political person than President Obama. President Obama sort of, the way he ran meetings was he wanted to hear just from the policy people first, wanted to hear their policy views, wrap his head around that, and then bring the political types in to understand what you could and couldn't do, how you could get it done. President Biden starts more with the politics. And it turns out starting with the politics can actually hurt you if you're running for re-election, because the reality of the policies will matter too, not just how they poll before you announce them, but the consequences of them after you announce them. No, just to be clear, we would have had a lot of inflation even without the 1.9 trillion. I think the Democratic incumbent would have lost even without the 1.9 trillion, even if they did everything else perfectly because of the inflation. So I don't know that this is the difference between winning and losing, but most of what I do isn't about like how to win or lose. It's what I think will make the world a better place. And look, there's a growing disenchantment with economic analysis, and that's why you have MMT, which says deficits don't matter, or Neo-Brandeisian, which says like big companies are always automatically bad. You don't need to do the cost-benefit analysis. And some of that might be a bit of a failure of economics. I think a lot of it is a failure to, one, appreciate that economics is a broad, diverse thing. If you took my class, we do the competitive market model for labor markets, and we do the institutional model. And so minimum wage, it's not like economics tells you it's good or bad. It gives you different theories, and it gives you an empirical method for testing that question. So I think some of it is a caricature of economics, where people don't understand it's actually more flexible than they appreciate. But some of it is economists are the annoying people who say, don't just look at the direct beneficiaries, look at the unintended consequences for everyone else, look at the trade-off. Budget, you spend more here, that means less there. Anti-monopoly, it says better thing here, worse thing there. And that's sort of like, annoying. I think economists, when they do that, are like speaking for the people. And when you don't do that, you just speak to the people who came into your office. And you hear, for example, from incumbent businesses more than you hear from future possible businesses. You hear from the beneficiaries of protectionism more than you hear from the people who get hurt by protectionism. But that doesn't make the second group not real. So I think analysis done right is sort of like a handmaiden to democracy, but not everyone thinks that.
We'll go with the ball and then back.
I haven't heard Trump be very vocal about building AI, but that competition with China seems like pretty relevant to his goals. So I'm wondering what you think the implications of his stated policies are for that race, or what his approach will
Yeah, so I
Repeat the question again. The question was about whether Trump, though he hasn't stated any particular goals regarding AI, whether that is central to his policy and sort of what the impacts his policy will have on the race between the United States and China on AI.
So last week I had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about how I would approach regulating AI. And in terms of just how incredibly persuasive I am, this one was retweeted by a guy named Casey Mulligan, who is chief economist of CEA under Trump 1 and is a lead candidate for CEA chair this time around. And he wrote, like, this is excellent. And so I'm sure he had a totally different view before he read the op-ed and just read it and loved it. So I'd love to think that my 6 principles that I put out there are exactly what will guide the Trump administration. And largely that started from the premise that we want more AI because it's a good thing, competition with China being one of many, many reasons, the one you had in your question. That doing that, we need to do cost-benefit analysis. You can't just say, is AI risky? No, we don't want it. But how do the risks compare to the risks of not having AI? That you don't compare AI to the ideal, you compare it to the alternative. And so, yeah, if AI is biased, that's not a reason to ban it if it's less biased than people are. And by the way, it's easier to unbias AI than it is to unbias people. Same thing with car crashes, et cetera. And then I think on a bunch of the regulatory side is actually deregulation to get rid of obstacles to AI, like all the energy that it needs. So my guess is that AI does fine under him and benefits from a combination of benign neglect, not having some of the sort of stupid or more risk-averse regulations, and does get the power it needs. The big caveat to that is how are they going to treat the big tech companies and the content coming out of the tech companies? Will Elon Musk have an influence, and will he try to do something about like OpenAI, which he hates, which he was one of the founders of, but hates now, and he has an alternative product. So do you end up getting some sort of crony capitalism retaliation against Google and OpenAI that gets in the way of progress? I think that is a very, very distinct and real risk, but I think the dominant probability is that it's fine, and that the United States gets so good at it that when it kills all of us, it won't be Chinese AI that kills all of us. It'll be American AI that kills all of us.
I believe there was a question back here. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of on a related note, following the recent ruling against Google, where the DOJ wants them to divest from their Chrome browser, kind of ongoing litigation against Apple, Amazon, and whatnot, how do you feel like the Trump team will tackle antitrust matters, given that they were super lax, back in its first term in 2016 through 2020, but it seems like the Biden team has been much more cutthroat and willing to block that.
Yeah. So there's a saying that personnel is policy. I think that's greatly overstated. Like on tariffs, the president's going to decide his policy. Personnel tells us a little bit, but not a lot. For antitrust, personnel is policy. So when he appoints a chair for the Federal Trade Commission and when he appoints an assistant attorney general for antitrust, we'll know the type of people they are and know what they're going to do, and they're going to be pretty independent and insulated in carrying that out. Oh, we don't know those appointments yet. My best guess is there are 3 buckets of things. The first bucket is the ongoing monopolization cases, which were the basis of your question against Google and the like, and that those continue almost exactly in the same way they would have if Biden had been elected. 1, they have a certain amount of momentum within the DOJ. 2, some of those cases, including the Google one that the judge just ruled on, were started during the Trump administration at the very end. And 3, they sort of don't like the tech companies, especially the ones that have any content associated with them, like Google. So I think the big monopolization cases against big tech continue, first of all. Second of all, I think everything non-tech goes back to a very permissive Republican attitude towards mergers, towards monopolization, and for better or for worse, you can sort of do what you want. So like the private equity industry, very excited about that, more exits, et cetera. It might be good, might be bad, but I think that's what will happen. And then there's the middle one, which is new stuff on tech, as opposed to continuing the ongoing stuff on tech. And I'm less sure which direction that will go, but my guess is that the government will be pretty tough on like Amazon, Google, and Meta, maybe not so much on Apple, but I don't know.
I'm wondering what you think about the Department of Government Efficiency and what effect that might have, particularly on maybe reducing the deficit.
The question is about the impact that the Department of Government Efficiency will have on the deficit and other potential consequences.
Yeah, so first of all, there's two different mandates it has. One is on the regulatory side. I think it could do a decent amount on the regulatory side because a lot of the ways to deregulate aren't really fully known to the government, and the president has an enormous amount of discretion to do it on his own, even more than he used to because of some recent Supreme Court rulings. So I think on deregulation, quite a lot coming out of it. On the spending side, this might be that like I'm inured and like a swamp creature and have spent too much time in the government. I am very skeptical that it does very much for a few reasons. One is I think the spending cuts are largely known and understood already. There's something called the Office of Management and Budget. There's a great group of career staff there. They know every stupid thing the government does. They like shout it all the time. No one listens to them. The reason no one listens to them is every stupid thing is somebody's income in somebody's congressional or Senate district, and both Democrats and Republicans like to protect that. So when I was there was some like helicopter gunship carrier thing, whatever. I don't know what it was, but like the Defense Department didn't want it. They're like, if there's a war, like even if it's the biggest war in the history of humanity, we're not even going to send the ship there because there's like nothing it can do that's useful for us. But it was made in Louisiana or Mississippi, I can't remember which one. The senator from there really liked it being made there. So I don't think there's much that they can figure out that isn't known already. I don't think there's much that Congress would do if they did figure it out. I think most of the excess spending in government is not efficiency. I think of efficiency as can you get the same output with a smaller cost of inputs. Social Security, for example, is unbelievably efficient. Less than 0.5% of Social Security spending is on bureaucrats. So if we had AI, we could make it 0.3 instead of 0.4. You don't save very much. To save money on Social Security, you have to decide, you know what, these people don't really need their money. That's not efficiency. That's sort of a trade-off and a choice. So I think there's very little. This government efficiency stuff, I'm not saying it's perfectly efficient, but less than you'd think. I mean, and by the way, when I say less than you think, go step inside a law firm one day, private law firm. They're really inefficient. They have like beautiful wallpaper and nice wood pillars and free food in the kitchen and lots of like people to like pick stuff up and staple it for you if you're one of the fancy lawyers there. Now go to the Department of Justice. It's like peeling paint and like crappy computers, and they're not paid very much, et cetera. Like you're getting more for your dollar at DOJ than you are in a law firm. So I'm very skeptical of that.
Any other questions? Yes.
You can kind of express your doubts of like the scope and magnitude of any potential like Trump tariffs, but like imagine we are in a world where we have non-Mexico tariffs. We know that these are kind of the objective of these tariffs is to kind of give U.S. industries and firms kind of an advantage on an international scale. Are you worried, or is there any like maybe indication that in the medium or long term future there is like a chance for these U.S. industries or firms to become kind of almost more stagnant, where they have less kind of international competition, less price competition? They may be less innovative overall.
Yeah.
Is there any concern of kind of that, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, just to put magnitudes on all of this, made up magnitudes again, after telling you should do analysis and get it right, you know, the Fed is sort of like my children. Even if there's like a 1% chance they're going to kill my children, I'll be pretty mad at you. And it might even be like a 5% chance he starts the process. Tariffs are more like, you know, my cousins. I'm not sure if it's like first or second cousins. I think the threat there is like 20%. It's higher than the threat is to the Fed right now, and like a 20% chance of murdering my cousins. I'm not so into that either. So I didn't want to be too reassuring. It's just I think, and 20%, by the way, you use the word tail risk. Tail risk is usually like 2% or 0.2 or 0.02. There's like some other word we need for like a quite bad thing happens with 20% probability. Someone has it. But anyway, yes, absolutely. I think this is true, by the way, the EV tariffs that we've done, electric vehicle tariffs under this administration, it will help the EV industry on a 2 or 3 year horizon. I would not be surprised if we are a less innovative, less competitive industry on a 5 to 10 year horizon. And so some of these, I think a lot of these tariffs won't work because they'll raise intermediate inputs. but they will change the industry shift, as I said before, but they'll change it temporarily. And insofar as it gets in the way of innovation and shields you from that competition, it might make you worse off over the long run.
Yeah, there's a follow-up. Yeah, do you think there's also a chance for some like newfound like political interest in these companies to kind of keep these kind of tariffs around, or potentially like keep a lower level of international competition? Or do you think this is kind of also?
Yes, absolutely. And look, one of the arguments for tariffs that is made is an infant industry argument. We just need it to protect our little baby, have it grow up, and then it's going to be able to fend for itself. And that was the rationale for the Jones Act, which restricted non-U.S. shipping between U.S. ports, 100 years ago. And our shipbuilding industry is evidently still like a defenseless little baby that needs this thing to continue. So absolutely, anytime you hear one of these things is temporary, don't believe it, because history is not on that side.
All right, so we have time for one more question. So yes, we'll go here.
With the new Doge department, I think one of the most, like the least efficient branches of government is the military-industrial complex. How do you think the new department will impact that, and how will that impact the economies that the military impacts in the U.S.?
Yes, it's a little bit my answer to, I think it was Rohan's question. In terms of how Doge affects the military-industrial complex. First of all, the term military-industrial complex was coined by Dwight Eisenhower when defense spending was, I think, more than like 12% of GDP, and now it's about 3% of GDP. So this is a much, much smaller piece of our economy than it used to be. The second is some of the inefficiency is stuff the Defense Department is aware of and can't do anything about because of the politics. The third thing I'd say is the prevailing view in Washington, rightly or wrongly, and I think I mostly agree with it, but I'm not an expert, is that the world is more dangerous than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. And whatever you thought the defense budget should be 20 years ago, you should want a higher defense budget today than 20 years ago. And so I would make a very, very strong prediction that defense spending will go up in inflation-adjusted terms over the next 4 years. Now, if we get more efficient, we could get like more national security output for every dollar of input at the same time. That might happen. I'm skeptical it will. It might. But even if we get more efficient, I think the net will be a desire to raise spending, not to lower it. And basically both parties think that at this point.
All right, amazing. That's all the time we have. We're super thankful that Professor Furman was able to take some time out of his very busy day to talk to us. So thank you so much, Professor Furman, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Okay, thank you.